Picture this. You're standing in the grand cathedral of a medieval kingdom, watching what appears to be a fairy tale wedding. The bride walks down the aisle in silken robes, her train carried by pages, while nobles bow in reverence. But as she approaches the altar, something makes your blood run cold. The bride's hands are trembling, not with excitement, but with terror. Her eyes dart desperately around the cathedral, as if searching for an escape route that doesn't exist. And when you look closer at her face, you realize the horrifying truth. She's just a child, barely old enough to understand what marriage means, let alone consent to it. What you're witnessing isn't romance. It's one of history's most systematic forms of abuse, disguised as political necessity and wrapped in the pageantry of royal tradition. These weren't just marriages, they were calculated transactions where little girls were traded like precious commodities, their childhood sacrificed on the altar of dynastic ambition. Before diving into these forgotten stories of innocence destroyed and childhood stolen, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these dark chapters of history together, from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared need to understand how power has always preyed upon the vulnerable. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of medieval brutality. It's the story of how entire civilizations normalized the systematic destruction of childhood, how political necessity became the excuse for unspeakable cruelty, and how little girls were transformed into living chess pieces in games they never chose to play. These names might not be familiar to you, but their stories will haunt you long after you finish listening. The practice of child marriage among European royalty wasn't an accident of history. It was a deliberate strategy perfected over centuries. Royal families understood that marriages were the strongest bonds between kingdoms, more reliable than treaties, and more permanent than military alliances. But they also knew that the younger a bride was when she married, the more completely she could be molded to serve her new family's interests. A woman who married at 20 might retain loyalty to her birth family. A girl who married at 8 would know no other home. This calculated approach to childhood destruction reached its most refined form in the courts of medieval Europe, where royal marriage had become a science of human manipulation. Court advisors would study potential brides like livestock, evaluating not just their bloodlines, but their psychological malleability. They preferred girls between the ages of 6 and 12, old enough to be trained in basic courtly behavior, but young enough to be completely reshaped by their new circumstances. The mechanics of these arrangements were chillingly systematic. Royal families maintained detailed records of eligible children across Europe, tracking their ages, health, and political value like inventory in a warehouse. Marriage negotiations often began when the intended bride was still learning to walk, with contracts specifying exactly when the child would be delivered to her new home and what training she would receive before the wedding ceremony. But perhaps most disturbing was how these families justified their actions. They convinced themselves that early marriage was actually protecting these girls, providing them with security and status they couldn't achieve on their own. Royal mothers who had themselves been child brides would speak fondly of their own experiences, creating a twisted cycle where victims became perpetrators, passing down trauma as if it were family tradition. The training process for these child brides was elaborate and psychologically devastating. Girls as young as 5 would be removed from their families and placed in special households designed to prepare them for their future roles. These weren't schools. They were systematic indoctrination centers where children learned to suppress their own desires, opinions, and even their natural emotional responses. The curriculum was designed to create perfect royal wives, lessons in multiple languages, music, dancing, and court etiquette. But underneath these seemingly innocent subjects lay something far more sinister. Girls were taught that their value lay entirely in their ability to please their future husbands, that their own thoughts and feelings were irrelevant, and that questioning their fate was not just inappropriate but dangerous. Physical preparation was equally disturbing. Court physicians would examine these children regularly, documenting their development and predicting their fertility. Girls who showed signs of early physical maturity were considered more valuable, while those who developed slowly were sometimes returned to their families like defective merchandise. The psychological impact of this training cannot be overstated. Imagine being 7 years old and being told that your entire future has been decided by people you've never met, for reasons you can't understand. These children lived in a constant state of anticipation and dread, knowing that their childhood was temporary and that their real life, a life of duty and submission, was approaching with each passing day. Many of these girls developed what we would now recognize as severe anxiety disorders. Court records describe children who stopped eating, who would wake screaming from nightmares, or who would sit for hours staring at nothing while tears streamed down their faces. But rather than seeing these as signs of trauma, royal families interpreted them as evidence that the girls needed more intensive training to prepare them for their responsibilities. The wedding ceremonies themselves were elaborate productions designed to mask the horror of what was actually happening. These weren't celebrations of love. They were public displays of political triumph, where the bride's family demonstrated their ability to form powerful alliances, while the groom's family showed off their newest acquisition. The ceremonies followed ancient traditions that emphasized the bride's transition from child to property. She would be dressed in clothing that belonged to her new family, symbolically shedding her old identity. Her hair would be arranged in styles appropriate to married women, even though she was still physically and emotionally a child. Most disturbing of all, she would be required to speak vows promising obedience and submission to a man she had likely met only days before. The crowd that gathered to witness these ceremonies understood exactly what they were watching. This wasn't a community celebrating the joy of two people choosing to build a life together. It was a political assembly witnessing the completion of a business transaction. The bride's tears were expected, her terror was normal, and her obvious youth was actually part of the appeal. But what happened after the ceremony was where the true horror began. These child brides were expected to immediately begin fulfilling their marital duties, regardless of their age or physical development. The wedding night was often the first time they truly understood what marriage meant, and the trauma of that realization would shape the rest of their lives. The pressure to produce heirs was immediate and relentless. Royal families had invested enormous resources in these marriages, and they expected returns on their investment in the form of healthy sons who could continue the dynasty. Girls who were barely old enough to understand reproduction were subjected to constant monitoring by physicians who tracked their cycles and predicted their fertility. The most tragic aspect of these arrangements was how completely they destroyed the natural development of childhood. These girls never experienced the gradual transition from child to adult that allows for healthy psychological development. Instead, they were forced to leap directly from childhood innocence to adult responsibilities with no preparation for the emotional complexity of marriage, motherhood, or ruling a kingdom. Many of these child brides developed coping mechanisms that would define their entire personalities. Some became completely submissive, learning to anticipate and fulfill everyone else's needs while completely suppressing their own. Others developed a kind of emotional armor, becoming cold and calculating as a way to protect themselves from further hurt. A few became skilled manipulators, learning to use their position to gain what little control they could over their circumstances. The stories we're about to explore aren't just historical curiosities. They're testimonies to the resilience of the human spirit and the terrible cost of treating children as political tools. These were real girls with real dreams, real fears, and real potential that was sacrificed to feed the ambitions of adults who saw them as nothing more than valuable objects to be traded and consumed. The most heartbreaking aspect of these child marriages was how the girls themselves were trained to believe their suffering was normal. Palace tutors would tell them stories of other royal brides who had married young and found happiness, carefully omitting the details of those who had died in childbirth or lived lives of quiet desperation. They created an elaborate mythology around royal marriage that painted these arrangements as romantic destiny rather than systematic abuse. Consider the case of Margaret of France, who was betrothed at age 3 to the future Edward IV of England. Her childhood was spent in a strange limbo, too young to understand her fate, but old enough to know she was different from other children. She was raised in a special household where everything revolved around preparing her for a life in a foreign country with a man she had never met. By age 7, she was already learning English customs, English songs, and English prayers, systematically erasing her French identity to make room for her future role as an English queen. The psychological manipulation was subtle but devastating. Margaret's tutors would praise her when she showed interest in English culture and gently correct her when she displayed too much attachment to French traditions. They convinced her that her value lay in her ability to adapt, to become whatever her future husband needed her to be. This wasn't education. It was systematic identity destruction disguised as preparation for greatness. What made these arrangements particularly cruel was how they exploited the natural trust children place in adults. These girls had no choice but to believe the adults around them who insisted that early marriage was normal, desirable, and beneficial. They were told that resisting their fate would bring shame upon their families and disaster upon their kingdoms. The weight of entire nations was placed on the shoulders of children who should have been playing with dolls and learning to read. The wedding preparations themselves became a form of psychological torture. Months before the ceremony, these child brides would be fitted for wedding gowns that transformed them into living dolls. The fittings were elaborate affairs where seamstresses would pin and adjust fabric, while the girls stood motionless for hours, learning to see themselves as objects to be decorated rather than people with their own agency. The gowns were designed to make these children appear older and more mature than they actually were. Padding was added to create the illusion of physical development. Makeup was applied to age their faces, and elaborate hairstyles were constructed to hide their youth. The entire process was designed to help observers forget they were watching a child being prepared for adult responsibilities she couldn't possibly understand. During these preparation periods, the girls were subjected to increasingly intense training in wifely duties. They learned not just how to manage a household, but how to anticipate their husband's needs, how to please him in conversation, and how to present themselves as desirable despite their obvious youth. Much of this training was conducted by older women who had themselves been child brides and now served as living examples of successful adaptation to their fate. These older women, many of whom had never known any other life, genuinely believed they were helping these girls by teaching them to embrace their circumstances. They would share stories of their own wedding nights, their first pregnancies, and their eventual acceptance of their roles, presenting these experiences as natural milestones rather than traumatic events. This created a twisted mentorship system where victims groomed their replacements, perpetuating cycles of abuse across generations. The political pressures surrounding these marriages created additional layers of trauma. These child brides understood that their personal happiness was irrelevant compared to the political benefits their marriages would bring. They were told repeatedly that their suffering was a small price to pay for peace between kingdoms, that their sacrifice would prevent wars and save thousands of lives. The weight of this responsibility was crushing for children who should have been learning to navigate simple friendships, not international diplomacy. The wedding ceremonies themselves were designed to overwhelm any resistance these girls might have developed. The pageantry was deliberately excessive. Hundreds of guests, elaborate decorations, expensive gifts, and constant celebration that made it impossible for the bride to process what was actually happening to her. The sheer scale of the event reinforced the message that this was bigger than her individual desires or fears. During the ceremony, these child brides were expected to perform their roles flawlessly, despite their terror. They had to speak their vows clearly, walk gracefully in heavy gowns, and smile appropriately while their childhood officially ended. Many guests commented on how mature and composed these young brides appeared, never recognizing that this composure was the result of months of intensive training designed to suppress any natural emotional responses. The consummation of these marriages was perhaps the most traumatic aspect of the entire process. These girls had been given minimal information about what marriage actually entailed, and the wedding night often became their first real understanding of what had been done to them. The physical trauma was compounded by the psychological realization that their bodies now belonged to someone else, that their childhood was truly over, and that this was to be their life from now on. Palace records from various courts describe the aftermath of these wedding nights, with clinical detachment that makes the horror even more apparent. Physicians would examine the young brides to confirm consummation, treating these traumatized children like livestock being evaluated for breeding potential. The girls' emotional state was considered irrelevant as long as they were physically capable of producing heirs. The immediate aftermath of these marriages often saw dramatic changes in the girls' personalities. Many became withdrawn and listless, displaying what we would now recognize as symptoms of severe depression. Others developed eating disorders, refusing food as one of the few ways they could exert control over their circumstances. Some began engaging in self-harm, using physical pain to cope with emotional trauma they had no other way to process. The pressure to become pregnant immediately was relentless and medically dangerous. These girls' bodies were not ready for pregnancy, but royal families couldn't afford to wait for natural development. Court physicians would prescribe various treatments designed to accelerate physical maturity, many of which were harmful and ineffective. The girls were subjected to examinations and treatments that violated their privacy and dignity while they were still trying to understand what had happened to them. When pregnancies did occur, they were often catastrophic. Girls aged 10 to 14 were expected to carry children to term and survive childbirth in an era when maternal mortality was high, even for fully developed women. The physical trauma of early pregnancy was compounded by the psychological stress of being expected to produce male heirs while still children themselves. The most tragic cases involved girls who died in childbirth, their lives ending before they had truly begun. These deaths were often recorded as necessary sacrifices for the good of the kingdom, with elaborate funeral ceremonies that celebrated their martyrdom rather than mourning the waste of young life. The families who had arranged these marriages would quickly begin negotiations for new child brides, treating their daughters' deaths as temporary setbacks rather than preventable tragedies. Those who survived childbirth faced a different kind of death, the slow destruction of their spirit, as they realized their sole purpose was to produce more children for a dynasty that saw them as nothing more than breeding stock. These young mothers, barely teenagers themselves, were expected to immediately begin preparing for their next pregnancy while caring for infants they were psychologically unprepared to raise. The cyclical nature of this abuse becomes clear when we examine what happened to the daughters of these child brides. Having known no other model of womanhood, these mothers would often actively participate in arranging similar marriages for their own daughters, convinced they were providing opportunities rather than perpetuating trauma. The normalization was so complete that resistance seemed not just futile, but incomprehensible. Isabella of Valois represents one of the most heartbreaking examples of this systematic destruction. Married at age 6 to Richard II of England, she spent her childhood in a foreign court, where she was treated as both precious object and political prisoner. Her daily life was regulated by adults who saw her as a future queen rather than a present child. She was forbidden from forming close friendships with other children, denied normal play activities, and subjected to constant supervision by handlers who reported her every word and gesture back to political advisors. Isabella's wedding portrait, painted when she was still too young to understand its significance, shows a tiny figure overwhelmed by ceremonial robes that seem to swallow her completely. The artist captured something haunting in her eyes, a kind of premature wisdom that speaks to the loss of innocence that had already occurred. She looks less like a bride than like a beautifully dressed prisoner being led to execution. The political machinations surrounding Isabella's marriage were particularly cruel because they treated her obvious youth as an advantage rather than a concern. English diplomats wrote enthusiastically about how her malleability would make her easier to control than an older bride who might have developed her own opinions. French negotiators praised her family's willingness to send such a young child, seeing it as evidence of their commitment to the alliance. During her years as child queen, Isabella was subjected to constant monitoring and evaluation. Court physicians tracked her physical development with the same attention they might give to a prized horse, documenting every change as evidence of her approaching readiness for motherhood. She was examined regularly, measured, and assessed like livestock being prepared for breeding, all while being told this attention was evidence of how valuable and beloved she was. The psychological impact of this treatment was devastating. Isabella developed what courtiers described as melancholia, periods of profound sadness where she would sit motionless for hours, seemingly disconnected from the world around her. Modern understanding would recognize these as dissociative episodes, a common response to trauma where the mind protects itself by disconnecting from unbearable reality. When Richard II died and Isabella was returned to France at age 11, she had spent more than half her life in England, but remained fundamentally isolated from both cultures. She was too English for the French court, but had never been truly accepted by the English nobility, who saw her as a foreign political tool. This cultural displacement was another form of abuse. These child brides were systematically separated from their roots and never allowed to develop genuine connections to their new homes. The story of Blanche of Lancaster reveals how these arrangements destroyed not just individuals, but entire family structures. Married at age 9 to John of Gaunt, she was immediately separated from her siblings and placed in a household where every relationship was defined by her future role as wife and mother. She was forbidden from maintaining close contact with her birth family, as her handlers feared divided loyalties might interfere with her adaptation to English customs. Blanche's training was particularly intensive because her marriage represented a crucial political alliance. She was taught to speak English without an accent, to prefer English food over the dishes of her childhood, and to express enthusiasm for English traditions while showing polite disinterest in her French heritage. This systematic erasure of cultural identity was presented as sophisticated education, but it was actually a form of psychological torture designed to create a person with no loyalty except to her assigned role. The wedding preparations for these children often lasted months, creating extended periods of anticipation and dread that were themselves forms of abuse. Blanche spent nearly a year being fitted for wedding clothes, learning ceremonial procedures, and practicing her vows while knowing that each day brought her closer to a life she didn't understand, but had been taught to fear. The elaborate preparations were designed to make the marriage seem inevitable and special, but they actually served to heighten the trauma by creating prolonged anxiety, about an inescapable fate. During this preparation period, Blanche was subjected to increasingly intimate examinations and discussions about her future duties. Older women would describe marital obligations in terms that terrified her, while insisting these experiences were normal and even enjoyable. This grooming process was designed to make her compliant during her wedding night, but it actually created additional layers of trauma by forcing her to anticipate violations she couldn't fully comprehend. The wedding ceremony itself was a spectacle of medieval excess designed to mask the horror of what was actually occurring. Thousands of guests celebrated while a 9-year-old girl was formally transferred from her father's ownership to her husband's control. The ceremony was recorded as a triumph of diplomacy, with chroniclers praising the beauty of the bride and the magnificence of the celebration, while completely ignoring the obvious tragedy of a child being forced into adult responsibilities. The most disturbing aspect of these historical accounts is how they normalize the abuse by focusing on political benefits rather than human costs. Medieval chroniclers would describe these marriages as successful if they produced male heirs and maintained political alliances, regardless of the suffering they caused. The girls themselves were rarely mentioned except as vehicles for dynastic continuation, their individual experiences considered irrelevant to the historical narrative. These stories matter because they reveal how societies can normalize the most extreme forms of abuse when they serve the interests of those in power. The systematic destruction of childhood that characterized royal marriage was not an accident or an unfortunate side effect of political necessity. It was a deliberate strategy that treated children as expendable resources in games of power they never chose to play. The legacy of these practices extended far beyond the immediate victims. The children produced by these marriages grew up in households where love was conditional, where personal desires were dangerous, and where human worth was measured entirely by political utility. This created generations of rulers who had never experienced healthy relationships and who perpetuated cycles of abuse because they knew no other model of human interaction. Understanding these historical atrocities helps us recognize how power structures can corrupt even the most basic human instincts to protect children. The royal families who arranged these marriages were not monsters. They were people who had convinced themselves that their political goals justified any means necessary to achieve them. This rationalization of abuse in service of larger purposes remains a dangerous tendency in human societies. The stories of Isabella, Blanche, Margaret, and countless other child brides whose names have been lost to history serve as a reminder that progress in human rights is neither inevitable nor permanent. These practices were not eliminated by moral enlightenment alone, but by changes in political structures that reduce the power of individuals to treat others as property. Their suffering was not meaningless if it helps us understand how to prevent similar abuses in our own time. These forgotten voices call to us across centuries, reminding us that behind every historical narrative of political triumph and dynastic success, there are individual human stories of suffering that deserve to be remembered and honored. Their childhood was stolen, their innocence was destroyed, and their potential was sacrificed to feed the ambitions of adults who saw them as nothing more than beautiful objects to be traded and consumed. But their stories survive, and in remembering them, we ensure that their suffering was not entirely in vain.